Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine. If you would like more information about how you can make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would encourage you to follow the link in our description. It will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we do still want to connect with you and help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we keep going in our study, we are now on session 10, and we're going to be studying John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40, and this is titled, I Find No Fault. So again, this is session 10, titled, I Find No Fault, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40. I want you to think for just a moment about maybe your favorite movie or television show that has some sort of courtroom scene in it. It could be a courtroom drama on television like Law and Order or one like that, or one that maybe just includes that as part of like a crime show. It could also be a movie like A Few Good Men or one of the various other movies that is out there that includes some sort of courtroom drama. And I just want to kind of think about that for just a second. And with that, what is it that makes courtroom dramas or makes those kind of courtroom movies so intriguing to us? What is it that draws us into those type of movies and makes them so interesting for us? And here's what we want to do. As we ask questions throughout this study, we want to encourage you to take the time to really interact with those questions. And so we want you to pause the video and really interact with us a little bit. And you can do that through pen and paper. If you have something, write some things down, write down the question, your answers to the questions. Or if you're maybe watching this with a spouse or family or whomever it might be, actually take the time to really have a discussion about it, talk about these things. And then in both cases, whenever we ask a question and you've done that, just hit play again. So we want to start off with this question. What is it that makes a courtroom drama or makes some sort of kind of movie about the legal system so intriguing for us? What is it that you find interest in those type of movies? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, write some things down, and then we'll keep going in our study. So these type of movies often provide very high drama. For me, I think one of the most intriguing things about those is seeing how maybe a lawyer or a defense attorney, how they essentially kind of outsmart their opposition, whether it's convincing a person to confess on the stand or give a confession, or maybe it's creating the reasonable doubt needed to get someone off the hook, to free them. Those type of things I find interesting, of how are they going to present their case, how are they going to speak, what questions are they going to ask, and how are they going to ask them in order to get the information or get people to think the way they want them to think. The strategy to that I find interesting. The book points out that people often enjoy trying to figure out who did it and are often pulling for the underdog of that day. Today, in our study, we will examine the legal drama of Jesus. He underwent Jewish and Roman trials with no defense and no jury. As we examine the scriptures, I want us to reflect on how Jesus proved that he was sinless and guiltless in every way. As we remember from our previous study, we've come to a place where Jesus has been betrayed. A lot has really transpired between that time and where we are at in our study today. Jesus has been betrayed. He has been taken away from the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's taken first to the former high priest, which was a guy named Ananias, and we can see that in the chapter that we're reading before the passage that we're going to focus on today. There, he is not only falsely accused, and it's done so in a way that they really come to no reasonable conclusion, but he's also abused. They punch him and they mistreat him through all of that. Ultimately, leading him on to the current high priest, which is Caiaphas. And the interesting thing about all of this is none of this is legal. They're doing it in the middle of the night. It's not public. It's not out in the open. All of these things would have been against the Mosaic law. This was not a fair trial. Nothing about this was good. He's brought to Caiaphas. He's examined again. The whole Sanhedrin is there. And eventually they just come to a place where they find him guilty of blasphemy, which is a crime that carries the death penalty in Jewish culture. And I want to read from you just for a little bit from Luke chapter 22, because I want you to see basically what happened and understand that what they are accusing him of and what they are condemning him of is ultimately not true. So in Luke 22, starting in verse 66, we read this. It says, "When daylight came, the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the scribes, convened and brought him before their Sanhedrin. They said, 'If you are the Messiah, tell us.' And he said to them, 'If I do tell you, you will not believe, and I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God.' They all asked, 'Are you then the Son of God?' And he said to them, 'You say that I am,'" which is kind of like saying, "You said it." And they say, "Why do we need any more testimony, since we have heard it ourselves from their mouth?" And so they took this as meaning, as being blasphemy, as being claiming to have equality with God, since they are claiming to be the Son of God, and they condemn him to death because of his blasphemy. And that's really where things progress and where we get into our passage today. Now, here's the interesting fact about what he says is that's true. He basically, first and foremost, he doesn't say, "Yes, I am." But he does give them the affirmation of you said it. You said it. It came from your mouth. Obviously, you want that to be true, and obviously, that. And the reality is, it is true. Jesus is the Son of God, and he is going to go sit at the right hand of the Father, and everything he says is true, and they want to accuse him of blasphemy, but it is actually truth, and it glorifies God to know that Jesus is at the right hand of the Father. The book goes on to say this. It says, "This brings us to the start of today's session. Since the Jews needed the Romans to carry out a death sentence, they shipped Jesus off to the court of the Roman governor, a man named Pilate." And that's where we're going to kick off today. We're going to be looking at John chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 28 and look through from 28 to verse 32. As we do so, I want you to listen for words and phrases that stick out to you in this passage. So in John chapter 18, picking up, give me just a moment here. John chapter 18, picking up in verse 28 and reading through to verse 32, it says this. It says, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would have been defiled and unable to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and said, 'What charge do you bring against this man?' They answered him and said, 'If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you.' Pilate told them, 'You take him and judge him according to your law.' 'It is not legal for us to put anyone to death,' the Jews declared. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what kind of death he was going to die." There's a lot going on here, and if there's one thing that really jumps out to me, and the book does point this out as well, there's one thing that really the book just points out is just the ridiculous hypocrisy that's going on here. You have the Jewish leaders who are coming to bring a man to Pilate to have this man killed, but at the same while they're very concerned about staying ceremonially clean so that they can eat the Passover meal that night. They know that they are trumping this guy up on false charges. They know that what they're doing is not right. They know that they're trying to see a man put to death solely to keep the status quo maintained and to keep the peace, we might say in the nicest way. But they are killing an innocent person, and yet they're worried about being defiled by stepping into the governor's courtyard. The hypocrisy is astounding, and it actually is just flat out comical. The book asks the question, why did the Jews have to send Jesus to Pilate if he had been already convicted of blasphemy? And the simple answer for that is the Jewish people had a lot of leeway. They had a lot of opportunity to self-govern, and one of the reasons for that is they were kind of a hard people to occupy. And so in order to maintain the peace but keep Roman government in place, they gave the Jewish people a lot of leeway to kind of manage themselves, but there was one restriction that they did make for them, and that is they couldn't execute capital punishment. They couldn't kill somebody. And so any sort of issue that required a death sentence had to be taken to the Roman authority, and they had to do the convicting. They had to do now. Now that makes for an interesting reality, because the typical, according to the law of Moses, way to execute a person was stoning. You'd throw rocks at them until you killed them. But in the in this point in time, Roman execution was done by crucifixion. And so if the Jews had been allowed to just kill Jesus themselves, he would have been stoned. But that's not what the prophecy said. That's not how things were going to go. On the contrary, Jesus was going to be crucified, and he is going to be hung from a tree, which we see if we go back into the Old Testament, about the curse of the man that's hung on the tree. And that is exactly what is going to happen. One of the things this really does point to is the fact that Jesus is in control of the situation. In fact, if we look at the passage, it says, they said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what death he was going to die. From even this point, while it looks like Jesus is the prisoner of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish people and is about to become the prisoner of the Romans, the reality is at no point in all of this is he not in control of the situation, and he is still accomplishing his perfect will. Here's a question for you to kind of think about. Pause the video, have some writing time or some discussion about it. It's this: what hypocrisy or contradiction do you see in these verses? We've pointed to that a little bit already, but I want you to look. Is there anything else? What other contradictions, what other hypocrisy do you see from the Jewish people or from the whole situation in this passage? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so we see in this passage just really a pretty fair amount of hypocrisy. We already pointed out their unwillingness to enter Pilate's residence because of the Passover. The book says it this way: they were committed to keeping the law of purity on one hand, but they were also more than willing to send an innocent man to be executed on the other. They were happy to keep the rules as long as the rules fit into their plans and schemes. And one of the things I find interesting, just kind of in relates to that, is he says, what has he done? And they just said, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. They wouldn't admit to it, because they knew that really Pilate, he wasn't going to care about a blasphemy charge. If it wasn't a threat to Rome, if it wasn't that big of a deal, he was going to just basically be like, listen, this is your problem, this isn't my problem. I'm not wasting Roman resources to kill a man that really has no problem with Rome, no beef. You have a beef with him, I don't have a beef with him. And they knew that. And so they're not even admitting what he did. They're just saying, it doesn't matter what he did. We're telling you that we want him dead. And we're going to really see that play out even more in the time to come. In fact, the hypocrisy is going to be interesting, because you have a Jewish group who are wanting to see a guy get killed even though they know he shouldn't. And then we're also even going to see Pilate, who really doesn't want the guy to get killed, but is going to allow him to be killed anyway. He's going to pervert justice, essentially, because he really just doesn't want to mess with the mob. And so really what we're going to see as this progresses in all of the hypocrisy is there is nothing about this proceeding that is legal. There is nothing about this that is right, good, just, or fair. This entire thing is essentially an abomination, so to speak, of the legal system, but all of it happened to accomplish what God intended. And that's really a pretty amazing thing. Let's keep going in the study. Let's look at the private conversation between Jesus and Pilate. And that picks up in chapter 18, verse 33. And I want to read verses 33 through about 38a, through the beginning of that. And don't worry, we're going to finish off the passage going through verse 40 here in just a second. So let's pick up in verse 33. It says, "Then Pilate went back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?' He said, 'I'm not a Jew, am I?' Pilate replied. 'Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?' My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over by the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. You are a king then. You say that I'm a king, Jesus replied. I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. What is truth? Said Pilate. So this is a really interesting interaction between Pilate and Jesus, and it doesn't seem like it really goes anywhere, but it really has some kind of interesting aspects about it. See, Pilate was not interested in the Jewish religious matters, only in things that might threaten Roman rule. And so his questions really have nothing to do with, well, did you blaspheme? Is what they're saying true? He doesn't care. What he does care about is whether Jesus is claiming some sort of kingship, because that would be considered treason. If he's claiming to be the king of the Jews, then the reality is that he is basically trying to put himself in place of Caesar, and that would be a problem. But Jesus answers in these kind of interesting ways. First, he kind of answers with a question like, who told you that? Are you the king of the Jews? Well, who told you that? Did you just come up with that on your own, or did someone tell you that? And he's really kind of pointing towards the chief priests. He's saying, like, did those people tell you that? Like, did they claim me? That's kind of what he's saying. Did they claim me as king of the Jews? And Pilate's response is, I don't care. I don't care. I'm not a Jew. I don't care about this stuff, whatever. And then Jesus begins to continue that dialogue with this kind of concept of, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom, that my kingdom is something else. And if my kingdom were just an earthly kingdom, then you would see people fighting for me and you'd see rebellion. But that's not the point of my kingdom. And really, Pilate, the only thing that he really picks up on is the claim to the kingship. And so he's like, oh, so you are a king. He's kind of keeping that dialogue, but he's figuring out very quickly that Jesus is not a threat to Caesar, and that nothing as Jesus is claiming anything that would threaten the rule of Caesar or the rule of Rome in Palestine. The book asks a couple questions. It says, what did Pilate ask Jesus, which we've already answered, and what did you think his tone was? And what did Jesus ask Pilate, and how does this show that he is once again in control of the situation? So I kind of defer that back to you. Let's take a moment, pause the video. In reading it, how did you read Pilate's tone in all of this, and his questions and what he does? And with that, was Jesus' reaction, did that point further to the idea that he was still in control? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, write some things down, have that discussion, and we'll keep going in our study. All right, so there's two big questions that get asked here, I think, by Pilate, and we're going to deal with the kind of the last question separately. And the first one is, are you the king of the Jews? And then the second one is, what have you done? And, the book asks what kind of tone it is, and I find some kind of humor in that, because we have talked about, how people have asked questions in the past. And I remember there was a time where the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees were talking to the man who had been lame his whole life and now was up and going, or I guess he was blind his whole life, and now he could see, and everybody was trying to get to the bottom of it. And we talked about the tone in which he kind of asked the question, you do not want to be his disciples too, do you? And, was it sarcasm, or was it him coming to the realization that the Pharisees wanted nothing to do with him? Tone is kind of a funny thing. It doesn't necessarily change what's being said or what's being asked, but it does change kind of what the expected answer might be. And so it's hard for me not to look at this as it says, are you the king of the Jews? That my first thought would be that he's kind of asking that almost in an arrogant way, like he is the Roman governor. He is actually in charge. And so he's looking at this man, and with full intimidation going on, he's saying, so are you the king of the Jews? Are you ready to back that one up? Or like, are you going to stand defiantly? Like he's kind of putting himself in the aloft position, and he's talking down to Jesus to let him know that he's in trouble. But then when the interaction starts to take place and the reality that the Jews have the ones that have handed him over and all that stuff, he finally goes, "What did you do?" I really kind of get to the point like what had started as the formal court proceeding, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is this accusation true?" Has now almost kind of digressed into almost a more one-on-one interaction. He's saying, "Listen, I'm not a Jew. This is crazy. What did you do? What did you actually do that they're trying to get you killed?" And then he begins to talk about, his kingdom and all that stuff. And then he responds with, "So you are a king? Oh, so wait a second." So like almost like a gotcha. "Oh, wait a minute, I got you." But then, even then, Jesus, his response back to it, he says, "So you are a king." And I want to read that back for you. And he says, "You say that I'm a king. I was born for this, and I have come into this world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." He just still points out, he goes, "So you are a king." He's like, "Listen, the moment we're in right now is what was my mission, was my purpose. Like whatever you do to me, whatever you're about to do to me is just going to further fulfill my purpose. Like there's almost an idea here, and he's not saying this necessarily to Pilate, he's more saying it to us. You cannot thwart God. And no matter how hard you try, I have come for this purpose, and what you are going to do is ultimately going to be the will of the Father." Pilate understood kings and kingdoms to be things about land and geopolitical and Caesar and Rome and all of those type of things. But Jesus saw a very different understanding of kings and kingdoms, and Jesus saw it from a spiritual aspect, and he knew that the day was coming where the kingdom of God would be the kingdom of all of creation. And so he was looking not at kings that come and go or Caesars or emperors or anything like that, but he was seeing the world as the eternal kingdom, the kingdom that exists now in this day in our hearts, and as we gather as the church. The book asks the question, how did Jesus' response to Pilate point to his innocence? And the reality behind that is just that definition between what kingdom Jesus was talking about. Jesus was not talking about an earthly kingdom that was going to get established with borders and governments that would have had to have fought off Rome and to take the land back, but it was a spiritual kingdom. It was one that would live in the hearts and the souls of the individuals, and because of that, he was not a threat. He was not a threat to Rome, and was not guilty of any sort of insurrection or treason with Rome, nor was he blaspheming, which was the big thing that the Jewish people wanted to pin him for, because he truly was the Son of God. Jesus' answers may have confounded Pilate, but he recognized that Jesus was no political threat. Still, Pilate wondered what Jesus had done to inflame the Jewish leaders. The book ends with this statement about everybody who is of the truth listens to the voice of Jesus. And Pilate, and I just always have viewed this as a scoff. It could have meant more, but I've always viewed this as the scoff of what is the truth. He's heard Roman truth and he's heard Jewish truth, and he's probably been well-traveled, maybe seen how people lived in Germania and whatnot. And this idea of truth to him was something that philosophers wasted their time on. And he was a man of action, and he was a man of government and of military might, and he wasn't worried about philosophical things of truth. He had heard about truth from here and there, and while he questioned the truth, the very definition of truth was standing right in front of him. He said, "What is the truth?" And we might have corrected him and said, "Who? Who is the truth?" Because that's a better question. Let's look at our last part of our passage now. We're going to read the rest of verse 38 and go through to verse 40. And I want you to listen for how each person involved react to the situation. So let's just do that. Let's read the rest of our passage. It says this: "After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, 'I find no grounds for charging him. You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?' They shouted back, 'Not this man, but Barabbas.' Now Barabbas was a revolutionary." Depending on your translation, the word revolutionary can also mean robber. More than likely, it is a kind of a generic term for criminal. Revolutionary to me seems like really giving him a lot more credit. He was an insurrectionist. He was one that wanted to create havoc and anarchy. He was a troublemaker. I think if you go to the King James, it just calls him a robber, because it just means he was a criminal. He was a bad guy who tried to violate things. And so what we see here is Pilate, after their conversations, he's like, listen, this guy is not a threat to me. This guy is not a threat to Rome. This guy's not a problem. He's just some preacher guy talking about truth and philosophy and living in a kingdom in the air type of stuff. He's not a problem, to anybody. And so he goes out to the people and he says, I find no reason to kill this man. I find no problem with this man. We can look at the other Gospels. I do believe he went ahead and kind of had him scourged before going out and having this conversation. So he beat him and he says, listen, this man does not deserve to die. I've punished him for you. Let's be done. Here, I tell you what, we have a custom at the Passover. I can give away one of two people. Do you want this guy who's been who's been a teacher, who's been all these things, who there's this stuff about him being the king of the Jews, or do you want Barabbas, who is a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser and causes all sorts of problem, a robber and an insurrectionist and all those type of things? Which one do you want? And I think Pilate, and this is just me speculating a little bit, I think Pilate thought this was an easy choice for them. Like, no, why would we want that troublemaker? That guy's a criminal. We'll take the teacher guy that so many of us like a week ago were celebrating when he got to Jerusalem. He's thinking this is going to be a no-brainer for him. And yet they said, give us Barabbas, crucify him. We want to see him killed. And I like what the book says. It says, Pilate lacked a commitment to justice. He believed Jesus was innocent of all the charges, but he was not willing to set him free. And so what we see, kind of what we said at the beginning, is that the Pharisees and their hypocrisy was they claimed to be the religious leaders and were obsessed about cleanliness, but were willing to let an innocent man go in there and be accused and beat, and ultimately they were trying to get him killed. That's not right. But then you have the guy who's the Roman guy that's there to be the peacekeeper, there to execute justice among the Jewish people, and he makes it abundantly clear, just even from this passage, he's really not. He's not there to execute justice. He's there, at best we could say, he is there to keep the peace politically. And so he is going to appease the Jewish people if he needs to in order to keep his job, keep the peace, even if that means a perversion of justice to have that happen. How should we characterize Pilate's attempt to release Jesus? Why were the people so easily swayed to follow the Jewish leaders? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll start to wrap up our study. I'll ask it again. How should we characterize Pilate's attempt to release Jesus, and why were the people so easily swayed to follow the Jewish leaders? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll start to wrap up our study. All right, so when we look at this, how would you characterize Pilate's attempt? I think that he thought this was going to be an easy thing. I think that he thought that he was going to give them two very, very different people, one that was clearly innocent, one that was clearly guilty, and that they would pick the right person. I think he was trying to find a loophole for them. He was giving them one more shot to reconsider Jesus and what he had done. But again, I don't think there's any commitment to justice here. There's a commitment to keeping the peace and keeping people happy, but not to justice. And when we think about why people would have been so easily swayed, we're that way too. I have to admit, we look at our world today, and whether you're a Democrat or Republican or this or that or the other, a lot of times, you like this news source or that news source, a lot of times we are willing to get riled up and swallow things that if we really stopped for a second, we'd know that it was a soundbite, that maybe it's not true, that maybe it's only true from a very, very specific perspective. And I think that often because, you listen to one news source say, and they present things one way, and you go, I don't think I really agree with that. And so then maybe you go look at the other news source, the one that's going to give the opposing view, and they present it a completely different way, and you go, but that's not right either. That's not right either. But not everybody does that. In fact, more often than not, the crowd tends to just believe what the people that they have followed their whole lives tell them to believe. And so there was no discernment. There was none of that. They just knew that these people who they'd been following for years are saying, this guy's a bad man and we need to do it. And they get caught up in the emotion of it all and maybe the self-righteousness of it all. And they just follow. And to be honest, it might have been dangerous to not follow. And it's like, well, I don't think I want to get lumped in with him or with those people, because then what they're doing to him, they might do to me. So there's fear, there's apathy, there's ignorance, there's all of those things play into it. And I would just say, and I don't mean this to be condemning because I'm saying this to myself as well, I don't think we would have been any different. I think we would have done the exact same thing had we been in the crowd. And it would have been hard if we were there in that moment not to go right along with the crowd shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." The book has this to say. It says, even though the Romans and the Jews miscarried justice in this case, Jesus was still in control of the situation. He knew everything that he was experiencing and everything that he would be facing were part of the Father's plan. Barabbas, who may have just had this moment in here, Barabbas is the one that ultimately takes that place, gets that releasing of the prisoner from crowd, even though he was not worthy of it. And so Jesus will go on to be crucified. Like the authorities, some people will reject Jesus regardless of the fact. Acknowledging that he is the Son of God requires them to recognize their sin and their need for a Savior. What serves as a comfort to those who follow Jesus become a stumbling block to those who reject them. And I want to challenge you with this as we close out our time today. I want you to think about, there's probably someone in your life that has rejected Christ. And no matter what you say, no matter what maybe you've invited them to or what you presented to them, they are still staunchly opposed to the idea that Jesus is the Christ. And here's what I want you to do. Whoever that person is, I want you to write them down on your paper or just kind of keep them in your head. And I want you to close out your time today praying for that person, praying that God would reveal the truth to them, that their heart would be softened, and that they might become open to the gospel. Now, that's probably not going to happen overnight. You're not going to go into work on Monday and say, "Hey, I want to tell you about Jesus," and they're going to and they're just going to be ready. It might, but I don't think so, but it might not. But I want you to begin to actively pray for that person. We can see the hard-heartedness of the Jews here and even maybe even some of those people that used to be crying out and singing the praises of Jesus. And I also believe that some of the people shouting, "Crucify him," here are going to be those people that were there at Pentecost and believed. And so we want to pray that God begins to soften their hearts and that they become more receptive to the good news of the gospel. So that's what I want you to do as we close out our time. Pray for those lost people that are in your life. Pray for you that we don't become, pray for ourselves that we don't become hard-hardened because of the things of life or whoever it might be. And then we want to encourage you to join us for worship right here at 11 o'clock. We are in person at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church, also online through Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us today. God bless.